I didn't say a word when the first steel panel hit the ground, but I remember exactly how it sounded. It wasn't loud, not in the way you'd expect something that expensive to be. Just a sharp metallic groan followed by a dull, final thud that traveled through the soil and up into my boots like a warning I was too late to stop. The air smelled like wet concrete and diesel, thick and bitter, clinging to the back of my throat as I stepped out onto what used to be my property line. My fence, industrial-grade steel posts, reinforced mesh, anchored 4 feet deep into packed clay, was laid out in twisted sections like it had never meant anything in the first place. The morning light caught the exposed rebar where they'd cut through clean, deliberate, professional. This wasn't vandalism. This was a plan. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, listening to the low idle of a bulldozer and the rhythmic hiss of hydraulic pressure releasing, watching men in neon vests move around like they were just another day on the job. No hesitation. No questions. Just progress. That's when I saw her. Victoria Hale didn't step onto the dirt. She never did. She stood on the paved edge of the subdivision road, white Lexus parked behind her like a statement, sunglasses on, clipboard tucked under one arm, like she owned every inch of what she was looking at. She gave me that tight, rehearsed smile people use when they've already decided you don't matter. "Morning, Ethan," she said, like we were neighbors sharing coffee instead of watching my boundary get erased. Her voice carried just enough sweetness to cover the steel underneath it. "We're opening up access here. Community expansion. You'll appreciate the upgrade once it's done." I looked past her, following the line where my fence used to run. Without it, the land opened up straight into their development. Fresh asphalt, identical houses, trimmed lawns that stopped just short of where my soil began. Or used to begin. Now there was no clear break. Just tire tracks cutting across what had been mine for 6 years. 6 quiet years I'd spent restoring that land, grading it, stabilizing it, understanding exactly how it behaved when the seasons shifted. I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I crouched near one of the broken posts, running my hand along the cut edge. Smooth, clean, done with the right tools, done by someone who knew what they were doing. And more importantly, someone who knew they wouldn't be stopped. "You filed for a permit?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Victoria tilted her head slightly, like she was humoring a question she'd already answered in her head. "Everything's been approved," she said. "County signed off. This is all perfectly legal." Perfectly legal. I'd heard that phrase before, usually right before something expensive had to be undone. Behind me, one of the workers shouted, and the bulldozer lurched forward, its blade pushing the last remaining section of fencing flat into the dirt. The vibration traveled again, deeper this time, like the ground itself was shifting under a new set of rules. I stood up slowly, brushing dust off my jeans, eyes tracking the path they were carving straight through my land. Straight through the exact spot I'd reinforced years ago for a reason no one here seemed to understand. Or maybe they just didn't care. Victoria tapped her pen against the clipboard, impatient now. "We'll be pouring concrete by the end of the week," she added. "Retaining wall, support structure, proper roadway access. It's going to look beautiful. Concrete, steel, permanent decisions made fast." I let that sit for a second, letting the words settle into place alongside everything else I was seeing. The slope of the land, the direction of the runoff, the subtle dip they'd just exposed by removing the fence line that had been holding more than they realized. I could already picture what they thought they were building, and more importantly, what they were ignoring. "You might want to double-check your plans," I said, finally meeting her eyes. She smiled wider, like I'd just confirmed exactly what she expected. "Oh, we have," she replied. "Extensively." Of course they had. On paper, this probably looked flawless. Clean lines, straight access, shared infrastructure that made everything more valuable for them. For me, it erased the one thing that kept this land balanced the way it needed to be. I took one last look at the torn fence, at the exposed soil beneath it, at the machines already repositioning for the next phase, and I felt that quiet shift inside me. The one that happens when a situation stops being a misunderstanding and starts becoming a problem you solve differently. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Because the truth was, they hadn't just taken something from me. They'd removed the only thing standing between their plan and something they didn't see coming. And they were about to lock it in with concrete and steel. I turned away from the noise, already running the numbers in my head, already mapping out exactly what they'd changed without realizing it. Victoria called something after me, but I didn't catch it, or maybe I just didn't care to. Because by then, I wasn't thinking about the fence anymore. I was thinking about what happens when you build something permanent on top of a system you don't understand, and how long it takes before it starts to fail. I should have stopped them right then. I bought this land 6 years ago with money I saved one contract at a time. Long nights spent reviewing structural reports under cheap desk lamps, and early mornings walking job sites before the sun burned off the dew. And I remember the first thing that hit me when I stepped onto it was how quiet it was. Not empty quiet, but stable, like the ground had settled into something reliable that just needed the right hands to keep it that way. And I knew within 10 minutes that whoever had owned it before me understood exactly what they were doing, because the grading was subtle but intentional. A half-degree slope here, a shallow basin there, nothing dramatic, just enough to guide water where it needed to go without anyone noticing. And that was the kind of engineering I respected, the kind that did its job without asking for attention. So I kept most of it intact and only reinforced what time had worn down, starting with the fence line, because that was not just about keeping people out. It was about marking the edge of a system that worked. 4-foot steel posts anchored deep into compacted clay, cross-brace sections designed to handle lateral pressure, and below that, something most people would never think about, a subsurface channel that redirected runoff during heavy storms. Not a pipe you could see, not something listed on any glossy development brochure, but a functional, quiet piece of infrastructure that kept the soil from shifting and the lower ground from saturating too fast. And I learned every inch of it the way you learn. Something you plan to rely on, walking it after rain, watching how the water moved, how it slowed, how it settled without pooling where it should not. And over time it became less like property and more like a system I was responsible for maintaining. Because land like this does not forgive shortcuts, it just waits for them to fail. And I had seen enough failed retaining walls and collapsed access roads in my career to know exactly how fast that failure can come when someone ignores what is already there. And that is why I chose this place in the first place, because it was honest, no hidden surprises, no unstable filled dirt, no rushed development decisions buried under fresh asphalt, just ground that behaved the way it was supposed to if you respected it. And for 6 years, that is exactly what I did. I kept the drainage clear, reinforced the fence where seasonal expansion pushed against it, and left the rest alone. Because good engineering is not about constant change, it is about knowing when not to interfere. And then Willow Creek Estates showed up on the other side of my boundary line. And overnight the quiet changed, replaced by the distant hum of construction equipment and the sharp, repetitive beeping of reversing trucks. And at first I kept my distance, because development happens. That is just part of the world we live in. But it did not take long to notice the differences in approach. The kind of shortcuts that look efficient on paper but never hold up in real conditions, shallow grading where deeper cuts were needed, retaining structures built for appearance instead of load, and most telling of all, water being redirected in ways that made things look neat during dry weeks but ignored what would happen during the first real storm. And that was when I first met Victoria Hale, standing at the edge of the construction zone in heels that never touched the dirt, talking about property values and community vision like those were things you could enforce with paperwork alone. And I remember thinking she understood contracts and optics, but not the ground she was building on, not the way pressure builds where you cannot see it, not the way systems interact when you remove one piece that everything else quietly depended on. And that fence she just tore down was one of those pieces, not because it was tall or expensive or impressive, but because it marked and reinforced the exact line where my system ended and theirs began. And without it, the balance shifted in a way no permit application was ever going to mention, and I could already see the next steps unfolding in my head. The concrete they were planning to pour, the steel they were going to anchor into soil that had never been designed to carry that kind of load in that configuration, and the way it would all look perfectly fine until the conditions changed just enough to expose the flaw. And as I walked back toward my truck that morning, boots crunching over gravel that used to sit neatly contained behind my fence line, I realized something that made me slow down just a little, because this was no longer about them taking something from me. It was about them inserting themselves into a system they did not understand and then locking it in place with materials that do not forgive mistakes. And once that happens, you do not get gradual warnings, you get consequences. and the worst part was they were going to finish building it before anyone thought to question it. I met Victoria Hale properly 2 days after the fence came down. Not out on the dirt where things were real, but inside the temporary sales office they had set up at the entrance of Willow Creek Estates. A polished little trailer dressed up to look permanent, with air conditioning humming softly and the faint scent of vanilla candles trying to mask the smell of fresh paint and new carpet. And everything inside it was designed to sell a version of reality that did not include what the ground underneath was actually doing. Scale models of identical homes arranged in perfect rows, glossy brochures showing green lawns and smiling families. And on the far wall, a framed site plan that simplified the entire area into clean lines and neat boundaries that did not exist outside that room. And Victoria stood in front of it like she was presenting a finished product instead of a work in progress that was already cutting corners. Her posture straight, her movements precise, every gesture practiced down to the way she flipped a page on her clipboard like it was part of a routine she had performed 100 times before. And when she looked at me, there was that same measured smile, the kind that acknowledges you without ever really seeing you, like you are just another detail to manage, another box to check before moving on to something more important. And I could tell within seconds that she was used to getting agreement, not resistance. Used to people nodding along to timelines and projections without asking what held those projections together in the first place. And that confidence came from somewhere, not just personality but positioning. Because people like her do not operate alone. They build networks, relationships with county offices, contractors who know which questions not to ask, inspectors who see what they are expected to see. And I had seen that pattern before on larger projects, just never this close to my own property line. And she walked me through her version of what they were doing, pointing to the map with a pen, explaining how the new access road would improve flow, how the retaining structure would stabilize the transition between elevations, how everything had been engineered to meet standards. Always that phrase, meet standards, as if standards were a ceiling instead of a minimum. And I listened without interrupting, letting her lay out the narrative she believed in, because the more she talked, the more I could see what was missing, not in what she said, but in what she skipped over entirely. No mention of subsurface movement, no acknowledgement of seasonal water load, no reference to the existing drainage path that had been quietly doing its job long before her development ever existed. And when I asked about soil reports, she answered quickly, confidently, referencing documents and approvals. But not once did she connect those reports to the specific changes they had already made by removing my fence and opening that boundary. And that told me everything I needed to know about how this project was being run, not by ignorance, but by assumption. The assumption that the land would behave the way the plan said it should, not the way it actually would under pressure. And then she introduced me to one of her contractors, a man in his late 40s with sunburned skin and a firm handshake, the kind of guy who had spent enough years on job sites to recognize when something fell off. And I watched his eyes for a moment as Victoria spoke, the way they flicked briefly toward the map and then away, like he had noticed something but decided it was not his place to say it out loud. And that hesitation was small, almost invisible, but it was there. And in this kind of work, those small moments matter, because they are where problems start, not with loud mistakes, but with quiet decisions to keep moving forward. And Victoria wrapped up the meeting with a summary of timelines, concrete, scheduled by the end of the week, steel reinforcement following right after. Everything moving quickly, efficiently, locked into place before anyone had time to question it. And she offered that same polite smile as she walked me to the door, like the conversation had resolved something instead of opening it up further. And as I stepped back outside into the heat, the sound of machinery carrying across the open ground, I realized that this was not just a disagreement about property lines or permits. It was a mismatch between how she saw the land and how it actually worked. And the dangerous part was she had the authority to act on her version of it, to pour concrete over assumptions and anchor steel into a system she had not taken the time to understand. And once that process started, it would not be easy to undo, not for her, not for anyone involved. And as I looked back toward the exposed stretch where my fence used to stand, I could already see the next phase taking shape in my mind, not because I wanted it to, but because I knew exactly what happens when you build confidence on incomplete information, and how quickly that confidence can turn into something else entirely when the ground decides to respond. The first truckload of gravel came in just after sunrise, and I heard it before I saw it. That low rolling crunch of weight pressing into soil that had not been prepared for it. A sound that feels different when you know what is supposed to be underneath and what is not. And I stepped outside with my coffee still in my hand, the steam mixing with the cool morning air, watching as the driver backed down the freshly opened path where my fence used to stand, guided by a man in a bright vest who kept waving him closer, closer, like distance did not matter anymore, like boundaries had already been decided, and all that was left was execution. And the truck tilted slowly, releasing a cascade of crushed stone that spread out unevenly across the exposed ground, filling spaces that had never needed filling before, covering over subtle contours that had taken years to settle into balance. And I could already see the problem starting to form, not dramatic, not obvious, just a slight change in how the material layered, how it resisted instead of absorbing, and how the natural slope that used to guide water was being flattened into something that would eventually push back. And behind that first truck came another, and then another, each one adding weight, each one compressing the soil in a way that ignored what lay just beneath the surface. And by mid-morning the sound of machinery had turned constant, engines idling, metal clanking, the steady hum of progress that looks efficient from a distance but feels different when you stand close enough to hear the details. And I walked the edge of the work zone, boots picking up fine dust that stuck to the soles, watching as they set wooden forms for the concrete pour, straight lines staked into ground that was anything but straight if you knew how to read it. And one of the workers glanced at me for a second, then back to his task, like I was just part of the scenery now, something that had already been accounted for, and moved past. And I understood that feeling because I had been on both sides of it, the side that builds and the side that watches something change without being able to stop it in real time. And it is a strange place to stand, knowing exactly what is happening, but also knowing that saying it out loud will not change the schedule already in motion. And by the afternoon they brought in the rebar, long steel rods stacked in neat bundles. The metallic smell sharp in the heat, and I watched as they began tying the grid together, spacing it according to a plan that looked correct if you only considered the structure itself and not the ground supporting it. And that was the part that kept settling heavier in my chest. Not anger, not frustration, just a quiet certainty that the system was being forced into a configuration it was never designed to handle. And I pulled out my phone at one point, scrolling through old photos I had taken when I first bought the property, images of the fence line, the subtle dip along that boundary, the way water had once moved through there during a spring storm, and I compared it to what I was seeing now, gravel packed where there should have been space, forms placed where flexibility used to exist, and I knew that once the concrete was poured, that flexibility would be gone, replaced by something rigid, something that does not adjust, something that transfers pressure instead of absorbing it. And that is when small miscalculations stop being small, because rigid systems do not fail quietly. They fail all at once when the load exceeds what they can carry. And I thought about saying something again, about walking up to Victoria or one of the supervisors and explaining it in plain terms, showing them exactly where the issue would come from and how it would develop over time. But I also knew how that conversation would go. Permits would be mentioned, approvals would be referenced, and the timeline would remain unchanged. Because stopping now would mean admitting something had been missed, and projects like this are not built to slow down. They are built to keep moving forward until completion. And as the sun started to drop lower, casting long shadows across the uneven surface they had created, I could see the outline of the future wall taking shape in the stakes and strings, a straight, confident line drawn across a piece of land that had never behaved in straight lines to begin with. And I stood there a little longer than I needed to, listening to the last truck pull away, the engine noise fading into the distance, leaving behind a stillness that felt different than it used to, heavier somehow, like the ground was already adjusting to what had been placed on it. And I took a slow breath, letting the dust settle in the air around me, knowing that by the end of the week, this would no longer be reversible without significant effort, and that whatever came next would not be gradual or forgiving, because systems like this do not offer second chances once they are locked into place. And as I turned back toward the house, I could not shake the feeling that they were getting exactly what they wanted, just not in the way they expected. I made the call that afternoon, standing in my kitchen with the window open, listening to the distant clank of steel being set into place while the smell of dust still hung faint in the air, and I already knew how the conversation was going to go before the first ring even finished, because I have been on the other end of these calls more times than I can count. The concerned property owner, the rushed explanation, the polite dismissal wrapped in process and procedure, and when the county office picked up, the voice on the line was calm, practiced, the kind of tone that carries authority without ever raising volume. And I introduced myself, gave the parcel number, explained what had been removed, what was being built, and most importantly, what had been there before that might not have been accounted for in their approvals. And there was a pause, not long, just enough for keys to click in the background, for records to be pulled up, for my situation to become a line on a screen, instead of a problem on the ground. And then the response came exactly as expected. Permits had been issued, plans had been reviewed, inspections would be conducted at the appropriate stages. Everything was proceeding within approved parameters, and I leaned against the counter, watching a thin layer of dust settle along the edge of the window frame, feeling that familiar disconnect between what exists on paper and what exists in reality. And I tried once more, shifting the conversation away from permits and toward conditions, explaining the drainage path that had been altered, the load changes that would come once the concrete was poured, the way the system had been functioning before any of this started. And there was another pause, slightly longer this time, followed by a careful acknowledgement that site-specific conditions are considered during planning. But unless there is a documented violation or immediate safety concern, construction is allowed to continue as scheduled. And that was the moment the door closed, not slammed, not abruptly, just gently, professionally, leaving no room for escalation without something more concrete than what I was describing. And I thank them, because that is what you do. You stay professional even when you know the outcome has already been decided. And I ended the call, setting the phone down on the counter with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet of the room. And outside, the sound of work continued, steady, uninterrupted, like my words had never left this house. And I stepped back out onto the property line, watching as the crew continued tying rebar into place, the grid expanding section by section, each connection tightening the structure they were preparing to lock into the ground. And for a moment, I considered walking back over there, not to argue, but to point, to show them exactly where the problem would come from, to mark it out in the dirt if I had to. But I could already see how that would play out. A brief conversation, a polite nod, maybe even a promise to look into it. And then the work would continue exactly as it had been, because stopping now would cost time, money, and credibility, and none of those things are surrendered easily once a project reaches this stage. And I stood there long enough to watch them finish another section, the sun reflecting off the steel in sharp lines that looked solid and certain. And I realized something that settled in slowly but firmly, like weight finding its place, because this was no longer a situation where I could rely on someone else to step in and correct it. Not the county, not the inspectors, not the people building it, because from their perspective, nothing was wrong. Everything had been approved, everything was moving forward exactly as planned, and the only person who understood how those plans interacted with what was already here was me. And that understanding came with a different kind of responsibility, not to stop them directly, but to decide how I was going to respond to what they were choosing to build. And I walked the length of the exposed boundary again, slower this time, taking in the details I had already memorized, the slight shifts in elevation, the areas where the soil felt denser underfoot, the places where water would naturally collect if given the chance. And I could see it all aligning in a way that was both predictable and unavoidable, because once the concrete went in, the system would change permanently. And whatever happened after that would not be something you could argue away with paperwork or permits. It would be physical, measurable, undeniable. And as the afternoon light stretched across the ground, casting long shadows through the framework they had set, I reached the spot where the first section of fence used to stand and paused, looking down at the compressed gravel that now covered what had once been a controlled edge. And I knew then that trying to stop them had already failed before I even picked up the phone, and whatever came next was going to require a different approach entirely, one that did not depend on permission or approval, but on timing and understanding. And I took a slow breath, letting the air settle in my lungs, steady and clear, because once they poured that concrete, the clock would start on something they were not prepared to deal with, and I would need to be ready before that moment arrived, because after that, there would be no more. Warnings left to give. The concrete trucks showed up before dawn, their headlights cutting through the low morning haze as they lined up along the newly carved path. Engines rumbling in a steady rhythm that felt more like a countdown than a construction schedule, and I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in my hand, watching the first drum start to rotate. That slow, heavy churn of wet concrete mixing inside, a sound that always carries a certain finality to it, because once it starts pouring, there is no adjusting, no reconsidering, just forward motion until everything sets into place, and the air shifted as the first load was discharged, that distinct smell of cement and moisture spreading across the ground, sharp and mineral, mixing with the dust that had not yet fully settled from the days before, and I walked down toward the boundary, boots pressing into the gravel they had compacted, feeling the difference immediately. The surface harder now, less forgiving, already beginning to behave like something that would resist change instead of adapt to it, and the crew moved quickly, efficiently, guiding the flow of concrete into the forms they had built, vibrating it into place to remove air pockets, smoothing the top with practiced motions that made it look clean, controlled, professional, and for anyone watching without context, it would have looked like progress, like improvement, like the kind of upgrade Victoria had promised. But I could see the deeper picture forming with every inch they filled, the way the mass was building over a section of land that had once been allowed to move, to breathe, to distribute pressure naturally instead of trapping it. And I kept my distance, not because I had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to say that would change what was happening in that moment, and I let them work, watching the retaining wall begin to take shape, a solid line of concrete reinforced with steel, rising steadily as each section was completed, and I could already visualize how it would interact with the ground once it cured, how it would redirect forces that had previously been dissipated across a wider area, how it would create a boundary that looked strong but would depend entirely on the assumptions made during its design, and assumptions, I had learned over the years, are where structures begin to fail long before any visible signs appear, and by midday, the first sections had already started to firm up, the surface losing its sheen, transitioning from fluid to solid, and I walked along the edge, careful not to step too close, observing the alignment, the spacing, the anchoring points where the steel met the concrete, and everything looked correct if you judged it in isolation. If you ignored what had been there before and what had been removed to make space for it. And that was the part that stayed with me, not the structure itself, but the context that had been erased, because without that context, even a well-built system can become unstable. Not immediately, not in a way that draws attention, but gradually, quietly, until the moment it reaches a threshold it cannot handle. And I thought about the rain that would eventually come, not today, not tomorrow, but soon enough. The kind of steady, soaking rain that saturates the ground and tests everything beneath the surface. And I pictured how the water would move now, how it would meet this new barrier, how it would search for paths that no longer existed, and how that search would translate into pressure in places that had never needed to carry it before. And I knew that once that process started, it would not be visible at first, not to anyone walking by, not to anyone signing off on inspections, but it would be there, building slowly, consistently, until it reached a point where the system had to respond. And as the last truck emptied its load and the crew began packing up for the day, the site fell into a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavier than before, like something had been locked in a place that would now dictate everything that came after. And I stood there for a moment longer, looking at the clean, straight line of the new structure cutting across my land, solid and unmoving, exactly as they intended it to be. And I understood that this was the moment the balance shifted completely, not when the fence came down, not when the gravel was laid, but now, when flexibility had been replaced with rigidity, when a dynamic system had been forced into a fixed shape. And from this point forward, everything would depend on how that shape held under conditions it had not been designed to fully account for. And as I turned away, the smell of curing concrete still lingering in the air, I realized that they had just created the exact conditions I had been anticipating all along, and now all that was left was time. The first sign was not dramatic, not something anyone else would have noticed unless they were looking for it, but I was, and it showed up 3 days after the concrete cured. Early in the morning, when the ground still held the cool from the night before, and the air felt heavier than usual, like it was carrying moisture that had not yet decided whether to fall. And I was walking the line where the new wall met the soil when I felt it under my boots, a subtle shift, not movement exactly, more like a change in resistance, the kind you only notice when you have spent years walking the same ground and you know how it is supposed to respond. And I stopped, pressing my heel down a little harder, testing it. And there it was again, that faint give where there should have been none, not because the structure itself was failing, but because something beneath it had started to adjust, and I crouched down, running my hand along the base of the wall, feeling the temperature difference between the concrete and the soil, the way moisture was beginning to collect along the seam, not pooling, not visible unless you were close enough to see the slight darkening of the dirt, but enough to tell me that water was already finding its way back into a path that no longer existed in the form it once had. And I stood up slowly, scanning the length of the structure, looking for other signs, and I saw them, small, almost insignificant variations in the ground, a slight bulge here, a faint settling there. Nothing that would raise concern on an inspection report, nothing that would trigger a stop work order, but enough to confirm what I had been expecting since the moment they started pouring. And I walked further along, past the midpoint where the wall cut across the natural slope, and I noticed how the gravel on their side had begun to shift, not sliding, just redistributing in a way that suggested the load beneath it was no longer uniform. And I could picture exactly what was happening below the surface, water being redirected by the new barrier, pressure building in areas that had previously been allowed to release it gradually, and the soil responding in the only way it could, by adjusting, compressing, moving just enough to accommodate the new conditions, and that movement, as small as it was now, would not stay that way once the system was fully tested. And I stepped back, taking in the entire scene, the clean, straight line of the wall, the neatly packed gravel, the fresh tire tracks from the last day of work, all of it presenting an image of control and order that felt convincing if you did not know what had been changed to achieve it. And I realized then that this was the point where most people would relax, where they would assume the job was done, that the structure was in place, and the problem, if there ever was one, had been solved. And that assumption was exactly what allowed situations like this to develop into something more serious over time, because the early signs are always quiet, always easy to overlook if you are not paying attention. And I pulled out my phone again, not to call anyone this time, but to document what I was seeing, taking photos from different angles, capturing the subtle shifts in the soil, the moisture along the base, the slight inconsistencies that would not mean much on their own but would tell a clear story when viewed together over time. And as I moved along the length of the wall, I noticed something else, a hairline separation where one section met another, barely visible, just a thin line that caught the light at the right angle. And I leaned in closer, tracing it with my eyes, knowing that it was not a crack, not yet, just a point where the structure was already responding to the forces acting on it, adjusting in ways that were too small to matter now, but would not remain that way indefinitely. And I stood back again, letting out a slow breath, because this was the confirmation I had been waiting for, not a failure, not even close, but a beginning, the first indication that the system was already under stress, already adapting to conditions it had not been designed to fully accommodate. And I knew that from here, it would only be a matter of time and environment, the right combination of moisture, temperature, and load, before those small signs developed into something more visible, something that could not be explained away as normal settling or minor variation. And I slipped my phone back into my pocket, taking one last look at the wall, at the ground beneath it, at the quiet evidence that was already forming. And I felt that same steady clarity settle in, because now it was no longer a question of if, but when. And as I turned to head back toward the house, the sky above had started to darken just slightly, the kind of change you only notice when you are already paying attention. And I glanced up for a second, feeling the shift in the air that comes before something builds, and I knew exactly what kind of conditions would bring everything to the surface. I spent that night at my desk with the window cracked open just enough to let the cool air in, the faint smell of damp soil drifting through as the humidity continued to rise, and I had every document I could find spread out in front of me, printed plans, county filings, soil reports, anything that had been submitted as part of the approval process, and I moved through them. Slowly, not looking for mistakes in the obvious places, but for gaps, for the things that were assumed instead of verified. because that is where systems like this begin to break down long before anyone notices. And the more I read, the clearer the picture became, not because the plans were careless, but because they were incomplete in a way that only mattered when you understood what had existed before those plans were ever drawn. And I found it buried in the drainage section, a single line, referencing existing surface flow patterns to be minimally impacted by development, a phrase that sounds safe on paper, but carries no real weight unless it is backed by detailed mapping and field verification. And there was none of that included. No survey of the subsurface channel that had run along my fence line, no acknowledgement of the way that channel had distributed water pressure during heavy rainfall. Just a generalized assumption that the ground would behave within expected parameters, and I leaned back in my chair for a moment, letting that settle, because that was not just an oversight. It was a blind spot built into the entire design, and everything that followed depended on that assumption holding true, and I knew it would not. And I pulled up older records, digging into archived county maps and previous land surveys, tracing back the original layout before the development ever started. And there it was, faint but clear, the natural drainage path marked decades ago, running exactly along the line where my fence had stood, not something dramatic, not a creek or a visible stream, but a functional pathway that had been accounted for in earlier documentation and then gradually reduced to a footnote as newer plans replaced older ones. And I could see how it happened, how each revision simplified the landscape just enough to make it easier to build on, how each step moved further away from the physical reality of the ground in favor of something cleaner, easier to approve, easier to sell. And by the time Victoria's project came through, that original path had been reduced to an assumption instead of a constraint, and that assumption was now buried under concrete and steel. And I flipped through the soil report next, scanning the data points, moisture content, compaction levels, load-bearing capacity, all of it technically accurate within the scope of the test locations they had chosen. But none of those tests had been conducted along the exact boundary where the most significant change had just been made. And that was the second gap, the one that connected directly to the first, because without understanding how water moved through that section of land, those numbers only told part of the story. And I reached for a notepad, sketching out the system as it had been and as it was now, mapping the old flow path against the new structure. And the lines did not just shift, they collided, forcing movement into areas that had never been designed to handle it. And I could see the pressure points forming on paper the same way I had felt them under my boots earlier that day, and it all aligned, every detail reinforcing the same conclusion. And I sat there for a while, pen resting in my hand, listening to the quiet hum of the house around me, the distant sound of wind moving through trees, the kind of stillness that makes it easier to think clearly. And I realized that what I had now was not just a suspicion or a professional opinion. It was a documented chain of cause and effect, something that could be demonstrated, explained, and eventually proven without raising my voice or stepping onto their side again. And that changed the way I approached what came next, because I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was preparing for what their decisions would inevitably create, and I gathered the documents into a single stack, organizing them in a way that told the story from beginning to end: original conditions, missing data, altered flow, new structure, each piece leading logically to the next. And I knew that timing would matter more than anything else from this point forward, because presenting this too early would only be dismissed as speculation, but waiting until the system revealed itself would make it undeniable. And I stood up, walking back over to the window, looking out toward the darkened shape of the wall in the distance, barely visible against the night, and I could almost trace the hidden path beneath it with my eyes, the one that no longer had a clear outlet, the one that would continue to carry water whether the design accounted for it or not. And I let out a slow breath, feeling that steady clarity settle in again, because everything I needed was already there, not in what they built, but in what they ignored. And now it was just a matter of letting the conditions develop enough to bring it all into the open. I did not plan on bringing anyone else into it at first, because problems like this usually unfold best when they are left alone long enough to reveal themselves. But the more I reviewed the documents and compared them to what I had seen on the ground, the more I realized that having a second set of eyes would not change the outcome, but it would strengthen how that outcome was understood when the time came. And there was one person I trusted for that kind of clarity, Someone who had spent as many years reading land as I had. Someone who did not rely on assumptions or shortcuts. And I made the call early the next morning while the sky was still a dull gray. The kind that promises rain without committing to it just yet. And when Daniel Harper picked up, his voice carried that familiar mix of patience and precision, like he was already halfway through solving whatever problem you were about to describe. And I kept it simple at first, gave him the location, explained the changes, mentioned the wall, the removed boundary, the altered flow, and there was a short pause on the line, not hesitation, just processing. And then he asked one question that told me he understood exactly where this was going. Did they account for the original drainage path? And I looked out the window at the wall in the distance, at the clean line cutting across what used to be a system that worked quietly in the background. And I answered the only way I could, not in any way that matters. And that was enough for him, because people like Daniel do not need long explanations, they need the right details. And he told me he would come by that afternoon. And when he arrived, he did not go to the house, did not ask for the plans right away. He walked straight to the boundary, boots pressing into the gravel, eyes scanning the ground the same way mine had been doing for days, and we moved along the length of the wall without saying much at first, just observing, taking in the subtle shifts, the moisture along the base, the slight inconsistencies that were already beginning to form. And after a few minutes, he stopped near the midpoint, crouching down to run his hand across the soil, pressing gently, testing the resistance, and I watched his expression, not looking for surprise, but for confirmation, and he gave a small nod, almost to himself, before standing up and looking back along the structure. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, the way it always is when he is stating something he knows to be true. They built this like the ground was static, and I let out a quiet breath, because that was exactly it. The simplest way to describe a problem that had been layered under approvals and assumptions. And we walked a little further, and I showed him the photos I had taken, the documents I had gathered, the older surveys that still marked the original path, and he studied them carefully, flipping through each page with the same attention he gave the ground itself, connecting what was on paper to what we were standing on. And when he finished, he looked up at the wall again, then at me, and there was no doubt in his expression, no uncertainty, just a clear understanding of what had been set in motion, and he did not say anything dramatic, did not talk about failure or collapse or anything that would sound like speculation. He simply outlined the sequence, how the water would behave, how the pressure would build, how the structure would respond over time, and it matched exactly what I had already mapped out, which meant we were not dealing with a theory anymore. We were dealing with a predictable progression, and that was the point where this shifted again, from observation to preparation, because now there were two of us who could see it, two of us who could document it, and more importantly, two of us who understood how to present it when the moment required it. And we stood there for a while longer, the air growing heavier as the clouds thickened overhead, the kind of quiet that settles in before weather changes the conditions in a way you cannot control. And Daniel finally glanced up at the sky, then back at the wall, and he gave a slight exhale, not frustration, not concern, just acknowledgement of what was coming next. And he said, "They are going to wish they had left that alone." And there was no emotion in it, just fact. And I nodded, because by then, everything was aligned, the ground, the structure, the missing piece that had once balanced the system, all of it moving toward the same point in time. And as we turned back toward the house, the first faint scent of rain touched the air, subtle but unmistakable. And I knew we were getting close to the moment when none of this would stay hidden anymore. The rain started just after midnight, not with a storm, not with thunder or anything dramatic, but with a steady, deliberate rhythm that settled in and refused to leave, the kind of rain that soaks instead of strikes, that works its way into the ground inch by inch until everything beneath the surface begins to respond. And I was awake before it even began, sitting at the kitchen table with the lights off, watching the faint reflection of the wall and the window as the first drops darkened the soil around it. And there is a certain moment, early in a rainfall like that, where nothing looks different yet, where the surface holds its shape and the structure appears unchanged, but you can feel the shift starting underneath, the slow saturation that builds pressure where it cannot be seen. And I stepped outside just before dawn, the air cool and heavy, the smell of wet earth rising with each step, and the ground felt different immediately, softer in places that had been firm the day before, more resistant in others where the water had nowhere to go, and I walked along the boundary again, hood pulled low against the drizzle, eyes tracing the base of the wall, looking for the signs I knew would come, not expecting anything dramatic, just the continuation of what had already begun, and there it was, subtle but unmistakable. The darkened line along the base had spread, the soil holding more moisture than it should have at this stage, and I could see small rivulets forming. Where the water was being redirected, thin lines cutting across the surface, searching for paths that had been closed off, and I followed one of them with my eyes, watching how it met the wall and then shifted sideways, pooling slightly before moving again. And that sideways movement was the key, the first clear indication that the natural flow had been interrupted in a way that forced the system to compensate. And I crouched down, running my hand through the damp soil, feeling the density change, the way it clung together more tightly than it should have, and I knew that beneath that surface, the pressure was building, not enough to cause visible damage. Not yet, but enough to begin altering the way the load was distributed across the structure. And I stood back up, looking along the length of the wall, and I noticed how the gravel on their side had started to shift more noticeably now. Small depressions forming where the water had begun to settle, areas where the surface no longer looked uniform, and I could already see how this would develop over the next several hours, how the continued rainfall would increase saturation, how the pressure would build incrementally until it reached the points of least resistance. And those points had already been identified, mapped out in my notes, confirmed by what Daniel and I had observed the day before, and I walked further along, past the midpoint, where the slope changed just enough to create a natural collection point. And there, the signs were more pronounced, the soil darker, the surface slightly uneven, and I could see a faint line along one section of the wall where the concrete met the ground, a subtle separation that had not been there before, not a crack, not a failure, just a response, the structure beginning to register the forces acting against it. And I pulled out my phone again, documenting everything, capturing the progression as it unfolded, because this was the moment where theory transitioned into evidence, where what had been predicted began to take shape in a way that could not be dismissed as speculation. And I stood there for a while, letting the rain continue its work, listening to the soft, constant sound of water meeting ground, a sound that most people would find calming, but in this context felt like a steady accumulation of something that could not be stopped once it reached a certain point. And I thought about the plans again, the assumptions built into them, the missing data, the simplified models that had ignored this exact scenario. And I realized that everything was happening exactly as it was always going to, not because of anything I had done, but because of what they had chosen to overlook. And that realization did not bring any satisfaction, just a quiet certainty that the next phase was already in motion. And as the rain continued to fall, steady and unbroken, I took one last look at the wall, at the ground beneath it, at the subtle changes that were becoming more defined with each passing minute. And I knew that by the time the rain stopped, this would no longer be something you had to look closely to see. By mid-morning, the rain had not let up, and the difference was no longer subtle, not something you had to crouch down to notice or feel under your boots. It had moved into that next stage where the system begins to show its strain in ways that even an untrained eye can pick up if they stop long enough to look. And I was already outside when the first real change made itself visible, standing near the midpoint of the wall with my jacket soaked through, watching the way the ground along the base had darkened unevenly, patches of saturated soil pressing up against sections of concrete that had been poured as if the pressure would always remain uniform. And that was the first assumption breaking in real time, because uniformity is a luxury that natural systems do not maintain under stress. And I walked along the length slowly, eyes tracking the line where the wall met the earth, and I could see it now without needing to search. That faint separation had grown, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw a crowd, but enough to form a continuous line in certain sections, a thin shadow that shifted as the light changed. And I stopped near one of those sections, placing my hand lightly against the surface of the concrete, feeling the difference in temperature where moisture had begun to collect behind it. And there was a subtle vibration, not movement you could see, but a response you could feel, the structure beginning to carry a load it had not fully accounted for. And I stepped back, taking in the broader picture, because this was no longer about individual signs, it was about how they were connecting, how each small change was reinforcing the next, building towards something that could not remain contained indefinitely. And across the boundary, I noticed a couple of residents from the development standing near their driveways, umbrellas held low, watching the water move across the surface, following the same redirected paths I had traced earlier, and even from a distance, I could see the confusion in the way they shifted their weight, the way they looked from the ground to the wall and back again, like they were trying to understand why the water was not behaving the way they expected it to, and I did not approach them, did not explain anything, because this was not the moment for explanations. This was the moment where observation speaks louder than any warning could have, and I continued along the boundary, reaching the section where the slope dipped just enough to collect more runoff. And there, the changes were more pronounced, the soil visibly saturated, small channels forming where the water had begun to carve its own route around the obstruction, and I could see how the pressure was concentrating behind the wall, how it was being forced upward and outward instead of moving freely along its original path. And that concentration is what changes everything, because once pressure finds a point where it can no longer redistribute, it starts to act against whatever is containing it, and that is when structures begin to respond in ways that are no longer gradual. And I pulled out my phone again, documenting the progression, capturing the same sections from the same angles as before, building a timeline that showed exactly how quickly things were developing. And as I moved further down, I heard a different sound mixed in with the steady rain, a faint, irregular tapping, like small particles shifting against a hard surface. And I followed it to a section where the gravel on their side had begun to settle unevenly, small stones slipping into newly formed depressions. And that was another piece of the system adjusting, the surface layer responding to changes happening below it. And I stood there for a moment, listening, watching, letting the details come together into a single, clear picture. And I realized that we had reached the point where this could no longer be dismissed as normal settling or minor variation, because the pattern was too consistent, too aligned with the conditions that had been set in motion. And as I turned slightly, I caught sight of a vehicle pulling up near the entrance of the development, the familiar shape of a county inspection truck, and I felt that quiet shift again, not urgency, not relief, just recognition that the next phase had begun, and that what had been building quietly over the past days was about to be seen by someone who would have to interpret it within the framework of regulations and responsibility. And I watched as the door opened and the inspector stepped out, pausing for a second under the rain before moving toward the area where the changes were most visible. And I knew that from this point forward, the situation would no longer exist only in my observations or my documentation. It would become part of a process that required acknowledgement. And as I stood there, rain steady against my jacket, I realized that everything we had prepared for was now unfolding exactly on schedule, just not in the way they had planned. The inspector did not rush, and that was the first thing I noticed as he stepped out of the truck, pulling his jacket tighter against the rain before walking toward the boundary with the kind of deliberate pace that comes from years of knowing that what you see first is rarely the whole story. And I stayed where I was, not approaching, not calling out, just watching as he moved along the edge of the wall, his boots pressing into the saturated ground, his eyes scanning the same details I had been tracking for days, the uneven moisture line, the subtle separation at the base, the way the gravel had begun to settle in irregular patterns, and I could tell by the way he slowed near certain sections that he was already recognizing the pattern, not necessarily understanding the full sequence yet, but seeing enough to know that something here did not align with how a newly completed structure should behave under these conditions. And he crouched down near the midpoint, running his hand along the seam where the concrete met the soil, pressing lightly, testing resistance, then looking back along the length of the wall as if mapping the changes in his head, and I saw him take out a small notebook, jotting something down, then pulling out his phone to take a few photos. And that was the moment the situation shifted from observation to record, from something that could be explained away to something that had to be documented. And he stood up again, turning slightly toward the development side, where the surface changes were more visible now, the shallow depressions, the redirected flow of water, and a couple of residents had gathered closer, standing under their umbrellas, watching with a quiet tension that had replaced the earlier confusion, because now there was someone official present, someone who could interpret what they were seeing in a way that carried weight. And after a few minutes, Victoria appeared, moving quickly across the paved area, heels clicking against the wet surface with a sharper edge than usual, her posture still controlled, but her pace just a little faster than it had been before. And she approached the inspector with that same composed expression, speaking in a tone that suggested this was a minor concern, something expected, something already accounted for, and I could not hear the exact words over the steady rain, but I could read the structure of the conversation, the way she gestured toward the plans, toward the wall, toward the overall development, as if presenting a complete picture, and the inspector listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention kept returning to the ground, to the details that did not match the narrative being offered, and that contrast was important, because in situations like this, it is not the explanation that carries the most weight. It is the consistency between what is said and what is seen. And as the minutes passed, I saw that consistency begin to break down, not dramatically, not in a way that would lead to an immediate decision, but enough to introduce doubt, enough to require further evaluation. And the inspector moved further along the wall, stopping at another section where the separation was more defined, pointing it out, asking something that made Victoria pause just slightly before responding. And that pause was small, almost unnoticeable, but it marked the moment where certainty gave way to explanation, and explanation is always a weaker position than certainty when the evidence is still developing. And I stepped back a little, giving them space, because this was no longer my conversation to have. This was now part of a process that would unfold according to its own timeline, guided by documentation, inspection, and the gradual accumulation of observable changes. And I could see the shift happening in real time. The way the inspector's posture changed as he gathered more information, the way his notes became more detailed, the way his questions became more specific, focusing less on general compliance and more on the interaction between the structure and the ground beneath it. And that was where everything we had prepared began to align with what he was seeing. Because the issue was never about whether the wall met basic standards. It was about how it interacted with a system that had been altered without full consideration, and that interaction was now visible, measurable, and most importantly, ongoing. And as the rain continued to fall, steady and unrelenting, I could feel that quiet sense of inevitability settle in, not because anything had failed, but because the conditions had reached a point where they could no longer be ignored. And as the inspector stepped back toward his truck, glancing once more at the wall before opening the door, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided in this moment, but it had already been set in motion. The rain finally eased sometime in the early afternoon, not stopping completely at first, but softening into a steady drizzle that left everything saturated and heavy, the kind of quiet that follows sustained pressure rather than a sudden release. And I stepped outside again, the air cooler now, carrying that dense, earthy scent that comes when the ground has taken in more than it can easily disperse. And the difference along the boundary was no longer subtle, not something you had to interpret or explain. It was visible in the way the soil had shifted, in the way the surface no longer held its clean, uniform shape, and along the base of the wall, that thin line we had been tracking had widened in places, not dramatically, not enough to draw alarm from a distance, but enough that you could see it without needing to crouch down. A faint but continuous separation that marked where the structure was beginning to respond to the conditions it had been placed into, and I walked the length of it slowly, taking in each section, noting how the ground had settled unevenly, how certain areas held more moisture than others, how the gravel on their side had redistributed in shallow dips and ridges that had not been there before, and it all aligned with the progression Daniel and I had mapped out, not accelerated, not delayed, just unfolding exactly as expected. And across the boundary, activity had slowed, not stopped entirely, but different now, more cautious, with workers standing in small groups, looking at the same areas the inspector had focused on earlier, conversations quieter, more measured, like the certainty that had driven the project forward had been replaced with something else, something that required attention instead of momentum. And I noticed Victoria near the edge of the development, speaking with someone I did not recognize, her posture still composed, but her gestures more deliberate, pointing toward sections of the wall, toward the ground, toward the areas where the changes were most visible. And there was a shift in how she carried herself, not a loss of control, but a recalibration, the kind that happens when a situation moves beyond initial expectations and into something that requires adjustment. And I did not insert myself into that space, because this was no longer about direct confrontation or explanation. It had moved into a phase where the conditions themselves were doing the work, where the interaction between the structure and the ground was presenting a narrative that did not need to be argued. And I reached the midpoint again, the same place where the first signs had appeared days earlier, and I paused, looking down at the soil, at the way it had compacted differently along that stretch, at the way the moisture had concentrated and then spread outward, and I could trace the path beneath the surface now without needing to imagine it. The original flow that had been interrupted, the pressure that had built behind the barrier, and the way the system was redistributing itself in response. And I pulled out my phone one last time, not out of urgency, but out of habit, capturing the final set of images that completed the sequence, from the first subtle shift to what was now clearly visible, a progression that told the entire story without needing a single word added to it. And as I slipped the phone back into my pocket, I took a step back, giving myself a wider view of the wall, of the land on both sides, of the changes that had settled into place over the past few days. And I felt that steady clarity again, not satisfaction, not vindication, just the quiet recognition that the system had done exactly what it was always going to do when its balance was altered. And I turned away from the boundary, walking back toward the house with the sound of water still dripping from the edges of the roof. A softer rhythm now, less insistent, like the pressure had eased just enough to reveal what had been building underneath. And I knew that from here, the process would continue through inspections, reports, and whatever decisions followed. But the outcome had already been shaped by the conditions that had been set in motion the moment that fence was removed. And as I reached the porch and paused for a second, looking back at the line of concrete and steel cutting across the land, I realized that what they had built was never the problem on its own. It was what they had ignored to make room for it that changed everything. And that is the part no plan can ever fully account for.